Hi, everyone. We're going to discuss what is educational research. Research is finding answers to questions. The basic goal of any research study is to understand something, to figure something out. You're in the world, you see something happening, and you want to understand why that's the case, or you have a problem or issue you want to solve. You need to find out answers to your questions. The way that you go about finding answers to your question in educational research is it's usually a systematic and objective process. You want to get reliable and accurate information to come from systematic and objective process. What's not a good way to answer your questions in educational research is tradition, meaning it's the way we've always done things. Authority, because someone else said that this is the way that it's why something is the way it is. Or common sense is a good thing, but in terms of research, just relying on your common sense without actually doing a systematic process to examine things is not the best way to find answers to your questions. Many of us, probably back to fourth grade or fifth grade, were introduced to research by the scientific method from John Dewey. And that's a very specific way of doing research. The scientific method is more the quantitative view of doing research, where you clarify the question that you have, you state a hypothesis that you believe based on all this research out there that these two things are related to each other. You then go out and collect and analyze data, interpret that information, you form conclusions derived from your analysis, and then you either verify or reject your null hypothesis. This is the core of quantitative research. Usually you're doing quantitative research when there's already been a lot of research on the topic because you can come up with a hypothesis that you want to verify. In educational research, there are some similarities to Dewey's scientific research, but there's also some things that are a little bit different. When you apply the scientific method to educational topics or questions, you are going to state the topic or concern that exists, specify the problem that the research will focus on, formulate the research questions or hypotheses about the problem, collect, analyze, and interpret data, state findings, results from the analysis of data, and then draw some conclusions to the original questions or hypotheses. Now I want to focus on step number 3, formulating the research question or the hypothesis about the problem. When you are developing a research question, the question ends in a question mark. And it's a question that you generally do not know the answer to. If you knew the answer to the question, you shouldn't be doing educational research around it. If you're just simply looking to state the obvious or to confirm something by finding research to support that, if you already knew the answer, that's not educational research. You really should have a genuine question. If you have a question mark at the end, many times your approach may need qualitative methods because you don't already have a hypothesis formed on what the outcome could be. Hypotheses, on the other hand, are you have a pretty good statement that you believe to be true based on lots of research that's already out there. So if you're working on a topic that there's a lot known about it, many times you can do a hypothesis. But if you're dealing with a brand new topic, idea, something new in the world, or you really just generally don't know why something you see is happening, it may be that you have a research question and a qualitative research question. Educational research is scientific. It does begin with a specific question, research question, or a hypothesis or goal. You do develop a plan in educational research. There's collection, analysis, and interpretation of data. And typically it's cyclical or helical, not linear. And the next image on the next slide, I'm going to show you what that means. But it does mean that it revolves and changes and refines over time. And you may go back and forth. And educational research, because we're dealing with people and human beings, it's not the same type of research as Dewey scientific research that typically happened in labs that could be very controlled. Educational research is very hard to control people. Educational research is there's a strong degree of objectivity and originality, and it should always be beneficial and meaningful. And I point out beneficial and meaningful and significant in that educational research, again, is not just going to the library and looking things up on a topic. That's one part of the research process, right? Educational research, there really should be a question or problem you're looking to look at. Now, as we've been talking so far, I'm talking about educational research. Now, this class, as you know about, is research and program evaluation. I want you to stay focused on research right now. And when we meet in class, we're going to juxtapose program evaluation, which has some similarities but differences. So keep in mind what I'm talking about now in this lecture is educational research, traditional research led by a hypothesis or a research question, and then finding the right approach to answer those questions, and then making conclusions. So as I mentioned, there'd be a figure. There's a cyclical or helical nature of educational research. And this just shows that as you look at a question, it evolves and changes over time until you get to a more defined research question. Educational research is not having predetermined outcomes where you are looking for research in the literature to prove what you would like to prove. It's not just simply gathering information. Yes, gathering information is a step in the research process, but it is not educational research itself, as we're talking about in this class. It's also not conclusive, meaning many times we have many more questions as a result of the educational research process than we have answers. We may answer very specific questions or answer a specific hypothesis, but it's usually never conclusive because we're looking at a particular population, a particular setting, and there's usually many more questions. Educational research is a very iterative process where we're building and growing and shifting over time. And it's certainly not trivial. Those that are hardcore quantitative researchers historically have sort of looked at educational research as being a soft research, right? It's not as, it's not as important. It's not the same as laboratory research, doesn't have the same kind of oomph as hard research. That's not the case. Learning about higher education, K through 12 education, educational research is not a small or trivial thing. It is critical and it's important to us and to society, particularly now. There's in light of all the different pedagogies people are using to reconstruct education in the light of COVID. Educational research is a process, and it's, again, not just the small step of looking some things up, but it's the whole process of solving problems and understanding education and what works and what doesn't work and how to make things work better. Quantitative versus qualitative research use slightly different approaches and processes. I look forward to us talking in class about quantitative versus qualitative, but I'll sort of set up the class session with giving you these things. Quantitative is deductive, and that's working from broad-based ideas, concepts, observations to a specific conclusion. So you've got a funneling or narrowing effect, such as in this picture here. So there are lots of observation and data in journals or in your experience, in your practice. There's a lot of data points out there on this particular problem. And then from all those data points, you start analyzing that data, and then you come up with a specific conclusion because of all the observation and data that's out there. So it's wide and then moving in. On the flip side, qualitative is said to be inductive. And it's inductive because your goal is you are starting from the bottom up. You are looking at specific observations and specific cases. And from those individual specific cases and observations, you come up with a theory that you might want to test, and you want to develop some kind of conclusion from those observations, from those very limited number of events and experiences. So you've got a few limited numbers of events of experiences, and the results of qualitative research are that you develop broad conclusions and generalizations. So you start with the specific observations, you analyze those to understand them more, many times through interviews or more in-depth analysis, and the result of your qualitative research gives you a broad conclusion or generalization that you might then use quantitative research to test. So think about that. We'll talk about that when we meet together in class. Some essential terminology we'll be using throughout the course, and that you should have been exposed to at different times. These were also highlighted in the foundation text, the text on the foundation section that I asked you to take a look at. I'll take questions on these when we meet. Variables, hypotheses, research questions, and research design. Variables are those things that vary or change in a study. A hypothesis is a statement that we're looking at, the research questions, and the research design. Please read about those in the foundations area and in the information, and we'll talk about these when we get into class. We'll also be talking about throughout this class, and as we start reviewing research articles, different research designs. And the research design is the way you go about testing or exploring that problem or question. Some of those are quantitative, some of those are qualitative, and there's different kinds of studies that you can do. So some examples of non-experimental designs are descriptive, comparative, correlational, causal comparative. And I'll give you some more to read about this throughout the semester. But they're not, the most important point to take away, non-experimental designs means you have not randomly assigned and you have not randomly selected your participants. You're not actually doing an experiment. You're doing research on things. On a descriptive study, it would be describing a case or something already in place. You haven't randomly assigned people to participate in that. You're just taking the environment the way that it is. In comparative studies, you're looking at two cases or multiple situations side by side. In correlational studies, you're looking to see if things relate to each other. But again, these are situations that are already there. It may be people in a higher ed program that are already in those situations and those circumstances. It's not that you have gone out, created a hypothesis, and then randomly decided that I'm going to give these people support, and I'll give these people no support in academic services, and then we'll see how we'll do. In education, we very truly have true experimental designs where you randomly assign and randomly select people into situations. And we do that, the reason we can't have true experiments that often is there's an ethical piece about withholding treatment or withholding something that could be educationally valuable to people. It can be done, it is done, it isn't done that often in educational research. Educational research, many times we have non-experimental research designs. Now, doesn't mean that they're bad research designs, they're non-experimental, we're taking advantage of the situation that we're in within education. Experimental research designs can be quasi-experimental or truly experimental. And quasi-experimental might mean that you haven't randomly selected people, but you've randomly assigned them to conditions. And by conditions, I mean those that are in a study, maybe some that receive some training for online technology, and then some students who hadn't received training. You already had the students, but you didn't randomly select them to be in your class, but you randomly assigned who got one treatment and who got another. Or you didn't randomly select students to participate in receiving the services from your higher ed office, but you randomly gave them different amount of services or different pieces of services. So quasi-experimental can be done in education more so than a true experimental design, although it still doesn't happen all that often in higher ed. And we'll have a good discussion question about why that's the case when we get into class. And it's because you're doing, you're putting people in treatment group or a control group. The control group is the group that doesn't get any of the special treatment or services, and the treatment group is the one that you're providing those services to. Most of the educational research that you'll read about in the journals are not true experiments or quasi-experiments. We may hit some of those. I think we'll see more non-experimental stuff. In terms of data analysis in quantitative research studies, we're going to spend some time talking about population versus sample and the concept of statistical significance in this course. I'd like to do that with you in person to make sure that we're really getting this topic. So we'll come back to that. We'll also talk about a lot of other terms. One of them is triangulation. Some people call it polyangulation. That would be more than three. Tri, like triangle, that means three. And in qualitative research in particular, and in non-experimental studies, we use the term triangulation to say that we're going to get 3 points of view. So maybe that's the student's view, it's an administrator's view, and the faculty member's view, or maybe 3 different research approaches. So triangulation can apply to the population, that you're going to get research from 3, you're going to confirm what you see in 3 different perspectives, or it might be in 3 different research approaches. So I'm going to do observations, surveys, and interviews so that I can get a multi-look at things. Triangulation is a key to seeing patterns in research, and it's particularly important in qualitative research and in non-experimental research, that we don't rely on any single perspective or any single point of view or any single point of data, that we triangulate the data in qualitative research, get multiple. Polyangulation would be more than 3. But what you'll hear most commonly, and what we'll probably see in some of these studies, is triangulation, looking at things from 3 different perspectives, or looking at 3 different approaches, and looking at multiple ways of looking at data from various examples. Now, in qualitative research, the experimental design, quasi-experimental design that we just talked about, and the non-experimental designs are typically used in more quantitative research, where you have a hypothesis and you're doing hypothesis testing. In qualitative research, we typically see designs such as these that are on the screen. That includes phenomenological studies, ethnographic studies, grounded theory research, and case studies. Most of us have heard of case studies and have read case studies, and that's looking using triangulated data or multiple perspectives to look at a case or a particular situation to understand that situation. In grounded theory, what you're doing is you're looking at many small situations, different cases, looking at that in depth to understand. You saw an interesting thing that was happening and you want to talk to people to understand why that's happening. And so you have some interviews, or usually focus groups in qualitative research, to understand what's happening in more depth. And then after doing multiple surveys or interviews, you then come up with a theory. That's grounded theory. So it's coming up with a theory. The end result is a theory in grounded theory in qualitative research. In quantitative research, the end, you usually start with a theory, and then you are looking to generalize from there. I look forward to talking with you more about this in class. But I want to give you a sense of the two different ways qualitative and quantitative come together, and how qualitative and quantitative, you may start with a quantitative study that's based on a lot of qualitative studies. These things are all interrelated with each other. Ethnographic studies are those studies that you're looking at understanding a culture, or people, and their real lived experience in relation to education. So an ethnographic study might ask, what is a first gen student's experience in my college or university? That might be the kind of question that you would answer with an ethnographic study. And a phenomenological study is where you're looking at a phenomenon that binds a group of people together. So it may be the phenomenon I want to look at is how first gen students, or whichever population that you may want, responded to COVID-19 and their educational outcomes. So the phenomenon here is COVID-19. And you want to know how this particular phenomenon impacted a particular group of people. You would use a phenomenological study. And many times phenomenological studies are using qualitative approaches such as interviews and focus groups. This is a brief overview of sort of the gamut of educational research that you'll be reading about, we'll be reading together, and we'll be learning about throughout this course. Mixed methods research designs is an approach to educational research where you're mixing both quantitative and qualitative. And there's benefits of combining the pros and cons of each in one study. I'm going to look forward to talking with you about some examples of when that can happen. Action research is particularly used in educational research when you're looking at the student learning data. So remember, last week when I introduced the class, or yesterday, whatever day it is, I talked about demographic and perception data. Then we talked about school learning data. Then we talked about school process data. So here with action research, it's usually focused on school learning or process data. So where you are actually someone that's teach or providing an intervention to students, and you want to study how that's working in action, and you are working side by side. You're actually a researcher that's conducting action with and using both kinds of data. So the goals of these approaches are different. Mixed methods research design tends to be more objective, and action research, you are there in the action with them, and it can be more subjective. Action research is the closest to program evaluation, in that you're usually looking to improve your own practice or teaching or program. Whereas mixed methods research design, you're still looking to generalize to a large audience. So typical research, educational research, the purpose is to generalize to a large audience, to understand something, and to generalize more outside of your area. Action research, qualitative research, and program evaluation do not have the same generalization outcomes. Their goal is to improve practice or to understand something in its own context, not necessarily to generalize more widely. So you're going to get to know your discipline a little bit more. We'll talk a little bit about library resources and some of the higher ed journals. It's important that you understand your discipline more so that you can make great decisions in your role as higher ed administrators. And one way to get to know your discipline more is to read research articles and other publications in your fields, whether those be the peer-reviewed research articles, program evaluations, or others. And your role as a researcher and as an educator is to learn about this research process, You should be able to conduct your own research if you need to. You should be a critical consumer of published research, and know what's good and what's not good. It's good to understand all of these processes, higher ed administrators, because you might need to write grant proposals. Um, if you're going to go on and conduct a thesis or dissertation, or if you're going to conduct your own research of your higher ed program, research is important. It's going to be such an important part of your lives as higher ed administrators. Certainly it's the center of this course, but you're going to be surprised. It's going to become the center of a lot that you do by the time that you're done. And actually, it's probably already a center of much of what you're doing. And we're just going to put words and shape to that in this course. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in class.